So today I'm going to tell you about the language of thought hypothesis of human cognition, and I'm going to try to explore it across all of the levels of my Mars hierarchy, from computational to implementation. And roughly what I mean by this is humans seem to have this capacity to attach symbols to all sorts of concepts, and then to combine these symbols together into nested structures for more complex objects. This is a pervasive idea in cognition, and for a relatively recent review, there's this 2002 paper about merge being the central element of all sorts of cognition domains in humans. This kind of mechanism allows humans to create new concepts by combining expressions together. For example, quadrilateral is really a thing that has four sides. Zigzag is an alternative set of parallel lines. And on engravings as old as 100,000-year-old, you find these kind of patterns, which are really several sets of parallel lines arranged in a very structured way. Under that view, understanding something really means building an internal program that represents that object. For example, describing this set of zigzag as something that generates that set of zigzag and is a really short program rather than encoding every single line. And so today my goals are to delineate the language of thought hypothesis in a simple domain, geometry, and then model this extensively, and then also sketch an account of what it means to go from sensory input to these kind of internal programs. And finally, try to outline how the brain might possibly implement something like this. And so roughly, it's going to go like this. We're going to start with simple geometric shapes. There's not going to be a lot of structure, but there's going to be interesting features of human cognition. And we're going to study how it works with MEG and how we can separate the kind of perception elements from the kind of symbolic elements. Then I'm going to move away from very simple shape and propose a generative language for shapes and show that it accounts some features of cognition, and sketch how one might implement going from shapes to internal representations. And then taking inspiration from recent work in rodent neuroimaging, I'm going to propose one possible strategy to try to implement these kind of representations with actual neurons. Sketch a new task where we can use these representations and show early evidence of these kind of representations in humans. And without further ado, let's just zoom in on one example. A whole lot of the early years of my PhD was about looking at example of an introductory task like this. The question being, can you find a shape that's different from the others? And if you're like most of our participants, this is extremely simple. It's the top right one, and it sort of jumps at you. But if I ask the same question about this one, it's really hard. In fact, even if I tell you that it's the top right one, you might not really be able to see it. And this is despite the fact that visually the displacement that I've operated on this shape is very similar. So really it's about something deeper than just the low-level perceptual features. And I've done this with a bunch of shapes, ranging across a whole variety of regularities, and be more specific soon. And the overall result, as you'd expect, is that the error rate massively increases as you remove some of these exact geometric regularities. So the rectangle and the square have a bunch of right angles, parallel lines, equal sides, and so on. And it's very easy to find an outlier. And then as you go to more and more irregular shapes, participants find it much harder. This is a really robust effect, so you can play around with all sorts of variations of this within the same task, and you get the same kind of effect. But you can also see the same kind of effects across tasks. So if you instead ask participants what their introspective notion of complexity is for a shape, they give you pretty much exactly the same metric. If you present these as sequences of dots where sometimes one is displaced, you get a similar kind of effect. If you do classic psychophysics visual search tasks, you get exactly the same kind of effects. So it really seems to be a very robust effect in human perception of geometric shapes. And at this point, you might think that this is very much driven by education or school or training about these shapes. But it turns out if you test kids at 4-year-old, you get a very similar kind of gradient of complexity across the shapes, where some of them are much easier than others, and the same one are easier for kids than for adults. And the same holds true for adults without access to formal Western education. So it's really not about explicit instruction about what a right angle is or what parallel lines are. You might also think that this is due to some low-level feature detector in vision or something like this, but in fact the same result holds true in blind participants doing the task with tactile 3D printed shapes. So it really is a sort of more fundamental feature of binding these things, detecting these features and then binding them together in a more compressed translation for a square and rectangle than for other shapes. And to make this modeling a little bit more precise, I came up with two contrastive models of these shapes. One of them basically takes the shapes and propagates them through a convolutional neural network, typical of like modeling the ventral pathway of human and non-human primates. And so basically what this is doing is you take the trial, you splice the 6 shapes, you have everything go through a neural network, and you pretend that the behavior answer of the network is whichever shapes end up being further away from all of the others in the internal representation of the network. And on the opposite scale of the spectrum, a purely kind of feature-based model where you count the number of exact geometric properties, like how many sides are parallel, how many sides have the same length, how many angles are right angles, how many angles have the same measure. You list all of these and you say a given trial, a given task of finding an outlier is as easy as you violate properties by going from one to the other. So if you move one dot of the square, you're going to violate many of these properties because you're going to break many right angles, many length equality, but if you move one from any regular shapes, you're basically not going to change anything. And now we can model all of these populations with these two models, and we see that in educated French adults online, you get mostly the symbolic model, and then in other populations, you get sort of a mixture of the two. And there's a lot of interesting findings here, but I'm not going to say much more about this. However, I am going to set the stage for another kind of analysis that we're going to do soon. Another thing you can do is instead of displacing parts of the shapes like this, you can now play the game of contrasting any two shapes. You have a certain number of shapes, and you just ask participants to find the intruder within. You take two different shapes, many copies of one copy of the other. You ask participants to find the intruder. And the reaction time and the error rate in this task can be used as a measure of how similar any two shapes are. And you can also use these two models as a way to account for how similar any two shapes are. And then you can model human behavior as a mixture of the dissimilarity according to a symbolic geometric feature model or according to neural networks. And you replicate pretty much the same kind of finding, which is that even though there is some effect of the kind of typical ventral processing of vision, it's mostly accounted for by this set of exact geometric features. And just as an aside, I'm not going to dig deeper into this, but it is really hard to elicit the same thing in baboons. So we've trained something like 20 animals for the exact same task. Only something like 10 to 15 of them get really good at the task, but even when they do, even when their performance is really good, the differences between the shapes do not look at all like the differences between the shapes in humans. So it is not the case that they find square easier than they find irregular shapes. They're good at the task, but they're sort of equally good for all the shapes. The reason why I was doing this kind of dissimilarity analysis based on these like matrices of how distant any two shapes are is that this is one way to do analysis of neuroimaging data. So then we collected MEG data of participants just passively watching shapes as they come in on screen. So you have to imagine a task, it's a little boring, where every second a shape appears on screen. It's like square, 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 and then it moves on to another one, rectangle, rectangle, rectangle. This lasts for almost an hour and a half. And then what you can do is you take the not the neural representation, but the sensor level representation, the MEG data out of the scanner for one shape, the MEG data for another. You measure how different these are, and then you do this for any two shapes, and that gives you an idea at a given time t how similar is the neural representation between the rectangle and the parallelogram. And you can do this for every time point. And then what you get is like this kind of interesting dissociation in time, where you have an early cluster of significant activity of something that looks like the neural network model, which is sort of expected, right? Because it is a pretty good model of the eventual pathway of human and non-human primates. But then starting around 200 milliseconds, the two flip around, and then you have one or two clusters of this symbolic or exact geometric feature model that lasts for about 200 milliseconds. And if you do the source reconstruction of these two clusters, you find that the neural network model ends up being projected mostly in the visual cortex, which is reassuring. And then you find that the symbolic model is projected to a much broader cortical network, which includes dorsal elements, dorsofrontal and mediofrontal elements. I don't have frontal data from macaques or from non-human primates, but the neural networks ends up being a very good predictor of the visual cortex of non-human primates, which is expected. And of course, the next question, given the behavior data that I've shown earlier, is whether the frontal cortex would show a representation of the symbolic model, but this I don't yet. What I'm not showing here, but I've seen since, is that we find the same thing in LFP data in patients with much more granularity in the localization and in fMRI, also in humans. At this point, I promised a language of thought, a generative model for shapes, but I've given you exclusively 11 quadrilaterals, so you might be a bit frustrated. But the next step was to take the whole program seriously and say, you know, given these kind of shapes that are tested throughout different cultures and different prehistorical records, can we come up with a generative language? So really think of it as a programming language, such that simple shapes are going to end up having short programs and vice versa. And then we're going to test the cognitive plausibility of this language for mental representations. And so I was spending sometimes fiddling around, finding prehistorical records, trying all sorts of candidate programs. We came up with one of them. There's a lot of discussion to be had about what is the right process one should follow to find one of them. And I'm not going to talk about this here, but once you have a candidate language, this thing can describe shapes. You can recursively enumerate shapes by order of, by size of the program. And the hypothesis is the shortest, the shapes with the shortest program should be the simplest one for humans in a range of tasks. And so that's exactly what we did. We sampled a bunch of shapes, which I'm showing here, ranked by complexity. So the simplest one is like the line and the circle. And then as you go deeper and deeper, you find that they're more complex. At least that's what we're arguing for. And the question is it indeed the case that the size of the shortest program is a good predictor or correlates with different behavior measures? And for this, I used the match to sample task, but with a little twist, which is that participants get to choose how long they're looking at the initial sample. So they press spacebar, a shape comes up. Whenever they release, the shape disappears, then there's a 2 second period. And they have to recognize the shape within a set of distractors that are carefully chosen to make the task hard enough so that they actually have to pay attention. And the metrics of interest here is, of course, how long it takes them to pick out the right shape, but also how long they self-pay themselves. Because this is also a measure of this is an introspective measure of how complex they think that a particular shape is. And And both the choice time and the encoding time, which is their self-based time, are predicted by the minimal description length. And then there's all sorts of more fine-grained analysis that one needs to do, mainly because as the complexity increases, all sorts of other visual property increases. So the gray level, the spatial frequency, the number of subparts. And so I went around the literature, listed a bunch of them, and then ran a regression with all of them. Unsurprisingly, many of them are predictive of human behavior, but crucially, it is always still the case that the minimal description length is a predictor of human behavior. Cool. But I'm making a kind of wild claim here, which is that as you're seeing these things, somehow you're doing some magic in your mind, and then you have a program on the other side. And the least I can do is at least try to convince you that this is a tractable problem, that it is indeed possible to go from these kind of squiggly lines to like an abstract mental, abstract program notation. This is in the AI literature, this is known as the program induction problem. I've collaborated with people who've worked on it extensively. This is Josh Enbaum and Kevin Ellis. And we worked on this dream coder algorithm. I'm not going to go into the details, but the idea is this is exactly the kind of machinery that does program induction. So it takes as an input a shape, and it searches the space of program until it finds a program that generates that particular shape. But a feature that this algorithm has is that it gets better and better as it sees more examples. And it can also start from a very small, kind of minimal language and slowly build up the right primitives to describe a set of geometric shapes. And so as you feed it more example, it's going to get better and faster at recognizing all of these shapes. And so if you train it with shapes that have different kind of general feature, it's going to learn representation that are more aligned with one or the other. Cool. Okay, does this make sense so far? Is this going, okay. Yes?
So, in your, you chose a particular language
yes.
for the generation of the minimal description line in your experiments. So could you compare different languages and kind of look for the languages which is most correlated with, for example, encoding time?
So, yes. With the experiment that I've done though, I generate the shapes starting with one language because I recursively, and so it's going to be harder to compare. Basically, almost certainly other candidate languages are going to be worse, but in principle, your approach would be better. It's also much harder, and this is one thing that I was hoping to do and maybe eventually get to do with these kind of algorithms, because they start with the smallest possible language that is compatible with drawing any shape, and then slowly it updates the language so that simple shapes get short descriptions. And so in principle, if you feed it human shapes, then it's going to slowly learn appropriate representations for these shapes. In the article about the generative language of shapes, I also do something completely different, which is shows some kind of general active properties. So for example, I don't have any of the slides here, but the complexity of drawing one shape out of a small template of another is only the sum of the complexity of the small shapes and the big shape. There's no interaction between the two, and it's not like you have to remember every single thing. So you can derive more general property, or you can zoom in on one language, and during the terminator space of searching the space of programming, not searching the space of program, searching the space of language, it's really hard. But in principle, yes. Yeah?
Do you think that like a minimal program length or a minimal language is like more crucial in the sense of like, yeah, I guess if our brain is forced to develop a language, does it optimize for like the minimal length for the most operations, or the minimal language?
Yeah, so there's a big trade-off here, of course, because you could keep having a bigger and bigger language, and then you would slowly make describing anything simpler, but you would have to remember a gigantic set of primitives or a gigantic language. It's really unclear where the trade-off is. One of the hypotheses that we ran in with the paper is that you start with something that is actually quite small, and you slowly learn the useful primitives in your environment, and then there's a trade-off between how much a new primitive helps you understand the surrounding environment versus how costly that primitive is, and then it's kind of a free parameter. And
so, like, the optimal strategy for finding this trade-off is to kind of search them together. So, like, you grow the length of the language and the language simultaneously.
yeah, this is exactly what Dreamcoder is doing. That's why there's this kind of inner loop where it goes back and forth between adding new primitives and explaining shapes, and then training the recognition patterns, so training the going from shapes to program, and then you start over again, and the hope is that you converge on something that is optimal for that set of shapes. Yeah. Cool. Yeah. All right. The next question is, how does the brain do absolutely any of this? Because I'm talking about symbols and programs and abstract notation, but at the end of the day, it needs to be implemented by a bunch of biological neurons. And so, taking inspiration from recent work from Mathias, who's in the audience, I've started to think about this. And just to briefly describe you the model, or the findings mainly. This started with mice running in a 3x3 grid, where there are 4 rewarded locations, A, B, C, and D, and you can only get them in that particular order. So you get a reward at A, then you run around, you find B, then you run around and find C, D, and then you loop back, you go back to A, and you do this over and over again. And when the animals get good enough, you move them to a new set of 4 locations, but crucially the structure is the same. There are 4 locations, they're rewarded in order, you explore, you find, you get good enough, you move on to the next task. And if you remember the general structure of the task, it's going to help you enormously, because at some point you're going to just find D and be able to go back to A and do the thing over and over again. They got animals to do these tasks, and then they recorded data from the medial frontal cortex. And what they find is, they find many things, but one thing that they find is neurons that are seemingly tuned to very specific kind of task progress periods. So if you look at the plot under task X, this is a neuron that fires in one particular task. It fires just after A. Whenever the animal goes from A to B, a little after A, it fires. And then if you track this neuron across tasks, you find that it often fires a little after a reward, but which reward it is seems to change across tasks. But if you go back to if you put the animal back into the original task if after some period the animal experiences the same task as earlier, you find that it fires at the same delay with regard to the same reward location. So X prime is really the same configuration as X, just a few sessions after. And you see that again it fires with a little delay after A. And indeed, if you compare how these neurons remap across different tasks, you find that they remap in very systematic ways. Where they basically remap to perpendicular locations. So if they fire after a particular reward, they're also going to fire after a reward in another task, but it might be a different reward. And then if you put them in trials with the same locations, it fires at the same time. And then digging deeper into this, if you try to understand what these neurons are doing across different tasks, if you try to align when they're firing to the different tasks steps. So for example, if you align the firing to the first location, location A, you see that it remaps in ways that aren't completely obvious. In the first task, it fires at A, but in the second task, they fire in the opposite phase. But if instead you align the firing not to the task progress, but to specific locations, you find that across tasks, it fires at the same task if this location is rewarded. And what this suggested, the main finding, the idea of this structured memory buffer, so it's this idea that each location has a bunch of neurons, but here I'm only going to talk about one neuron, an anchor neuron that fires whenever this particular location is rewarded. You have one for each location, and this whole workstation moves synchronously, and is a kind of always vertical representation of the task structure. So A fires, and then the whole thing moves. Sorry, the neuron for location 1 fires, and then the whole structure moves, and now the neuron for location 5 fires, and it happens to be the next rewarded location, and so on and so forth. You have more than one for each of those, but for simplicity, you can think of this as encoding the information about which location are rewarded in the activity of these neurons, and then the whole model being synchronized with the animal's velocity or the task speed, so that it's an instantaneous representation of not only where the reward is right now, but where the rewards are going to be in the future, that is self-updating, so that when it turns, it's still true, because in the meantime, the animal has moved to the next location. And there's some preliminary evidence that a similar kind of representation is present in humans. And this got me really excited, because this is the first, to me at least, the first kind of very promising model of a very abstract task structure all the way down to individual neurons. And my question was, how general is this mechanism? What can it actually encode? Because obviously this task is very far from the kind of thing that I cared about in humans. And so the next step was, let's just make this incrementally more complicated and test humans. And so I had humans work with long sequences of items, such as what I'm displaying here. So it goes A, B, C, A, B, C, D, E, F, D, E, F, and then A, B, C, A, B, C, D, E, F, D, E, F, D, F. Right, so the idea is, this is really an ABAB sequence, but each individual letter is itself a triplet of things that repeats. Right, so it goes A, B, C, A, B, C, D, F, D, E, F, and then the whole thing repeats a second time. Where the identity of each individual letter ends up being instantiated by sampling an object and displaying it to the participants. And crucially, with each trial, the identity of these objects is going to be different. The only thing that's constant is the general structure where it goes A, B, C, A, B, C, D, E, F, D, E, F. Just to give you an idea of what this looks like, participants eventually, as you'll see, are lying in a scanner and then looking at things like this. And every second they see an object, and the only thing that's true is that the sequence of object goes A, B, C, D, E, F, D, F, and the whole thing repeats. And mostly to keep them entertained, but also because I had additional questions, there's a task. And the task is, after they've seen enough of these, I tell them, swap the order of either the A elements or the B elements of neither of these, and tell me whether the group was ever followed by the clock. For the results I'm showing here, the task doesn't really matter, but it matters because it forces participants to really remember the whole sequence. And once you have this, the question is, what kind of models, what kind of predictions can we make from this kind of structured memory buffer? The first one is something like, you could have a long clock, a long structured memory buffer, as I've shown in the rodent results, which has 12 elements, A, B, C, A, B, C, D, E, F, D, E, F. That would work. That would be vertical. The whole thing would turn in one slot, and then it would be true again, and so on and so forth. But obviously this is missing, this is not using the fact there's a lot of structure inside these sequences, that there's things that repeat within these sequences. So in a sense, it's very costly, and you could do better. As a contrast to this, I'm going to present two others. The first one is the idea that you have one clock for the one structured memory buffer for the ABC part, another one for the DEF part, and then you have some sort of gating mechanism that's telling you, half the time you should read from this one, half the time you should read for the other one. The other hypothesis says not only you have two structured memory buffers like this, but they themselves behave like rotating memory buffers. There's the current one and there's the next one, and it's not like one is gated and not the other, it's that every 6 items they swap around, and so the representation of the buffers themselves is a buffer that updates. I hope this makes sense. I'm going to unroll an example right now. There's an additional parameter here. I'm sure there's a bazillion additional parameters, but I'm going to name one. Is the question of what is the clock that's not currently being read out doing while you're reading out the main one. Basically, the question is, as you're thinking about ABC, what is happening with the DEF representation? How can we test these different models? Well, one way to do it again is to do RSA analysis, representational similarity analysis. This is the predicted representation under a single structured memory buffer, hypothesis 0 from the previous slide. If your sequence is like belt book clock, and then belt whatever this is, key. So this is under the hypothesis that you have a 12 long, 8 item wide representation with no saving for the internal structure. And this is the representation when you're at the first 8. So it's telling you now is this one, the next one is going to be the book, the one after is going to be the clock, and then it's going to be the belt again, and so on and so forth. And this is the representation at B. The whole thing has moved one time point, so the first column is gone to the last location and everything else has shifted. And now you can take these two rotations, measure how similar they are, do these for any pair of rotation, and there you go. You have a prediction of how similar two different time points should be in terms of neural representation. But you can also do this with the other hypothesis, where you have two different memory buffers. When they update, one of them turns and not the other, and then you measure how similar they are. You do this for all pair of points, and you get a different prediction of how similar any two time points should be. But crucially, what I'm showing here is within one particular trial, within one particular sampling of like A, B, C, D, E, F. But in principle, you can do this across different trials and get much better predictive power. So if you think about it, what this is saying is, across different configurations, how similar are two time points if the next one is going to be the same item? And there's nothing that prevents you from looking at this, right? Even if the current item is different, maybe two representations that have the same next item are going to be more similar than two representations that have different next item. And so you can really play the game of like measuring the dissimilarity across trials. And this is what I did with our participants. So really, this is the same kind of analysis as you've seen before. They're looking at these kind of ABC, D, F sequences. I'm going to ignore the first set of A, B, C, D, E, F, because at that point the participants don't know what the items are, and so their representation cannot be faithful to the structure of the task. But then I'm going to take the neural representation at D, the neural representation at A, for two different trials, measure how similar they are. Yeah.
What defines a trial? Are there different stimuli in the spots?
Yeah, so basically they see one 24 item long sequence, because it goes A, B, C, D, F, D, F, the whole thing repeats. Then they have to answer a question, and then they move on to a completely new sampling of items. Yeah. And so the difference between that particular D and that particular A was whatever, you measure it, you put it in a matrix, and now you have an empirical measure of how similar are any two time points across any two trials. And you can model this with the different hypotheses that I mentioned before. And I'm just going to add one more hypothesis, which is just there to remove some trivial things in the data. the thing that dominates these empirical matrices is the fact that if you're currently seeing the same object, the neural representation is very similar. And so the more stupid model that says the only thing that matters is whether participants are looking right now at the same object. I put as a separate predictor, it is extremely significant, and then we can move on and model the rest. And these are the three other models. The non-structured memory buffer is what I'm calling H0, and then you have the two different kind of structured memory, like nested structured memory buffer. The unstructured memory buffer is marginally significant, and I have a theory of why. I just haven't taken the time to model this, but I don't think this is going to survive. And then you have the gating one that ends up being significant, and the nested swapping one that ends up not being significant. So really what this is suggesting is, as you're doing the task, on the one hand you're memorizing A, B, C, and you're rotating these around when you're using them. On the other hand, you're remembering D, E, F, but you're not, you're reading from one or reading from the other. You're not reading from the current one and putting the other one in the other location and then swapping them around. You keep these two representations separate. This is, yeah?
So just to be clear, what you're saying is you don't have a readout of what the next structured memory buffer is going to be. So you just have a readout of what you're doing now, the sort of the section of the sequence that you're doing now, and that's how the RSAs differ, basically. Yeah.
It's almost this. It's you're keeping separate. Basically, you have your structured memory buffer A, big A, 1, and your structured memory buffer 2. You don't have your current structured memory buffer and other structured memory buffer that you swap.
Yeah.
So you keep these two representations separated.
What does it mean to say frozen?
Yeah, so this terminology is still in progress, but the question is, as you're looking at ABC, is anything happening with DEF or not? As you're moving around, when you're currently thinking about C, is the other clock also turning and currently representing F or not? And this analysis does not allow us to distinguish these two. But in principle, both could happen. Yeah.
Could you clarify what is on the y-axis of this graph?
It's the coefficient in GLM where everything has been normalized. And if you're thinking these are low value for coefficient in the GLM, I agree. But you have to remember that this is a slightly unusual kind of representational similarity analysis where each single cell is it's not the average of several triplet. It is one difference between two topography at one time point. And so it's incredibly noisy. So it's not completely surprising.
This is a whole brain?
This is at the scale of whole sensor. One day I will do the source reconstruction analysis, but I haven't done it yet. So this is whole brain. This is literally taking these kind of sensor space values. Cool. All right. The other thing you can do. So RSA analysis are really indirect. You're collapsing all of these things. It's really unclear exactly what is influencing what. I personally love them, but the literature is not always excited about them. So the other thing you can do is try to go for a more direct decoding-based kind of analysis. And that's what I'm going to describe here. So you take different trials. You take the neural representation at one particular time point, say E. Using that neural data, you can try to predict the content of that particular trial's item A. So taking the neural data at E, can I predict the identity of the object at A? And you can do this for a bunch of trials and then test on held out data to see if you manage to decode the identity of something using neural data from something else within the same trial. So it's always within one trial, right? Because you can't possibly decode across, but you can train on a subset of trials and then test on held up trials. And just to give you an idea of if you do the simplest thing of trying to decode the identity of A as the participants are looking at A, you get very prototypical kind of visual decoding that are pretty good and pretty robust. And if you try to decode the identity of E using the neural data at A, which is quite far away, right? This is the one I'm drawing on top right. You can still do it, but it's really not that great. But you can do it, and you can do it consistently across all of the other, right? There are 36 possible of these crossings, right? 6 A, B, C, D, E, F, decoding 6. You remove the diagonal because this one is trivial. That leaves you with 30 values you can predict, and most of them are above 0. So you can decode, you can more or less decode the identity of anything based on the neural data at any other location. This on its own, I think, is a cool result because that means that you can linearly decode from the neural data the identity of anything anywhere else, which is really not obvious. But even better, once you have a decoder like this, you can start asking specific questions like, what if I take my decoder pre-trained and I now apply it to another item? And here the question is, I trained to predict the identity of A from the neural data at E, and now I apply these to F. Is this going to predict A again, or is this going to predict B? So really what this is saying is, if both memory buffer are receiving the same velocity signal, they should both turn at the same time, and so you should generalize by decoding B. But if you have one that's currently ongoing and the other one that's currently not doing anything, then you should still decode A. And what we find is, in my view, convincing evidence that the structured memory buffer that you're not paying attention to is not receiving velocity signal, it's not turning around. So as you're thinking ABC, ABC, the other one is not doing anything on the back of the line. Cool. There's a lot of similar generalization tests that I need to run because this is across structured memory buffer. You could do this within structured memory buffer. You could test, basically, this is a new way to test the same thing as I did with RSA, and I'm going to slowly unfold all of these. The issue with this is, and the reason why I'm showing the one where I go from somewhere inside the EF to somewhere inside ABC, is that as soon as you get data where you're decoding the value of A from the neural net A, this dominates everything because it's a visual decoder and not an abstract decoder, and so it's a bit more involved. Cool, yeah?
Do you see a distance effect? I mean by this, can you better predict E than D than C?
Sorry, say again?
Do you see a temporal correlation effect?
Yes. So the reason why I'm doing this across on these faraway distances is that you can really decode the identity of A from the neural data at A, but unfortunately, as you can sort of guess from the plot, A to A, this has a long tail, and so as you're looking at B, you still have the long decoding tail of A, and this is polluting a lot of these results. So it's a little harder to do these kind of analysis for things that are close in time because it's confounded by this kind of slow decay. Yeah, thanks. Cool. So I'm going to recap briefly. I think the language of thought hypothesis might be the best model in town for mental representation. I think this, but this is also a recent behavioral and brain science paper not authored by me, which I think is a good read. By limiting yourself to a very small domain, and crucially a non-linguistic domain, you can test very specific representations and try to explore how general they are and try to ask the question how they're acquired. So I think this is a really fruitful way of thinking about these questions. And I hope I convince you that I delineated an algorithmic account of how you do this and try to sketch some implementation level accounts of how this might be implemented. Although there's obviously an enormous set of questions here. And so ongoing work and independently kind of exciting work that is happening involves going back to mice and trying to see if they can learn a nested ABCD tasks. So it's basically the same thing. They go A B A B C D C D A B A B C D C D. And this is not a cherry-picked example, and because it's not a cherry-picked example, the mouse is a bit confused. It's not really doing anything, but it's kind of adorable. I think it now needs to go to C, but it hasn't. Yes, there you go. Okay. And now it's going to go to D, hopefully, but it's trying to be on the way, so who knows? So that's one direction. Another one is this structured memory buffer emerged from RNNs with the right kind of biological constraint. And so an obvious question is, do they learn this kind of hierarchical workstation? What kind of new constraint do you need to add for them to learn this kind of workstation? And then another set of exciting question is, that is only a theory of the workstation, but not a theory of how you actually populate these neurons with the right kind of information. And so one of the most exciting directions for looking to this is replaying humans, and I'm doing a little bit of this with Amy Wong, but also Senya here in Oxford is doing very exciting research on this. And with this, I want to thank everyone, you, and also the whole university and SLUC. Thanks.
Any questions, Mathias?
Thank you for this fascinating talk. So, in your language of thought, did you also include loops? So, they were just only kind of sub-functions?
So, I'm not the only one to have proposed these kind of very explicit accounts of language for specific domains. And the first thing almost anyone adds is a notion of loop, because across basically any cognitive domain you can possibly imagine, having to do something 5 times does not cost 5 times the cost of one thing, right? It costs the cost of one thing plus some ideas that you need to do it 5 times. So definitely in the one that I proposed for geometric shapes or something like this, people have done similar things for auditory sequences, for navigation sequences. They always have a notion of loop. Conversely, these structured memory buffer that were discovered for the ABCD task are basically the lowest possible implementation of something that repeats, which is basically a loop without a counter. You don't really know how many times, but you know you have to do it over and over again. And in a sense, my hope is that once I get a better understanding of whether these kind of structured memory buffer are implementing something like a loop, then I could try to get them to implement the 5 other operations that my language has, and then now I have a new theory of the whole thing. But I'm far from that. Yeah.
Got one from Jake. In the project of symbolic into cortex, is the wide variation also seen within a single participation, or just participant probably, or just across many participants, but each participant has a more localized activation?
So in the what? I didn't get the meaning of the question.
I'm not sure to follow. Oh, I think this is for your sort reconstruction of the symbolic model. Is there a is it like individual?
Yeah. So that particular analysis was performed with MEG, and the localization is generally quite bad. So I think this is even true within one participant, that it's basically going to project to a whole set of cortical areas. Independently, I have some fMRI data that is a little bit better, but then the task is also a little bit worse. So I don't have a definitive answer, but I think it is a wide network. And my intuition for this is the early processing is done by your typical ventral pathway of object recognition or general vision processing. And then somewhere in the frontal cortex, you have this very structured abstract workstation of geometric features. But along the way, you need to build this workstation and integrate them together. And so it might involve the intravertebral sulcus, the dorsolateral. And so all of these gets activated in the geometric feature model, but not in the visual model. Dreamcoder is really the brainchild of Kevin Ellis, who's a theoretical computer scientist. So everything is lambda calculus, and it is the right way to do it. It's also impossible to read. But it's all represented in strongly typed lambda calculus. And then getting into more details basically is, I don't think, the most useful thing right now, but I'm happy to exchange emails about this.
And then another one, do you consider generative shapes with different costs might be geometrically equivalent, i.e. homeomorphic?
That's a very good point. So the early literature, there's a whole range of literature in experimental psychology about Euclidean, which Euclidean invariants are cognitively plausible. And so, for example, size seems to really be one of them. So people don't care about the size of a shape, or rather, people are happy to call two identical shape of different size the same shape. I don't know if that's the best way to phrase it, but if you look at the classic, if you take Euclidean geometry, another one that is strong is the rotation invariance, and this one is less obvious in cognitive psychology. And I think a classic example is the fact that kids and even adults don't really love calling, squares on their, angle. They call these diamonds. They don't like calling them squares. So scale invariance seems to be quite deep. Rotation invariance not so much.
Any other final questions? Maybe I'll finish with one. In your kind of modeling, like the frozen version of the memory buffer model, are you thinking about that like in some of Leaping Wang's monkey data where they're looking at different shapes or whatever, and then they have that kind of put them into different subspaces that kind of move around. And then when they have to, there's like some paper about like some special one that you just have as like a special thing that you can kind of like put there to hold. You think about this in the same way that you kind of like have a separate subspace that you just kind of put it in, it holds, it stays static.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of similarities in the ABCD findings, in the Liebing and Chen findings, and in what I'm trying to do here. So in the macaque paper, what happens is when they have to reverse the order of a 3-item sequence, so the items goes ABC, but the macaque has to produce CBA. What they find is that they don't only use 3 subspaces, really they use 4 on the first approximation, and the fourth one they used to put C, and then they put A in C, and then they put C A. So they kind of have an extra buffer in which they can put some information and then retrieve it. I don't quite yet understand the mechanism behind it, so I don't know if it's similar, but in general, I think I'm quite happy to think of these things as quite similar, wherein you have 3 subspaces ABC, 3 subspaces D, E, F, and then a lot of things could happen, but it turns out, as far as I can tell, what happens is half of the time you're looking at one, half of the time you're looking at the other, and when you're looking at one, you're really not doing anything at all with the other. It just stays as a stable, self-sustaining subspace, and there's nothing happening.